You are strapped into a seat the size of an armchair, inside a machine worth $2 billion, and you are not allowed to get up. Not for long, anyway. Somewhere behind your shoulder, there is a cot, barely 6 feet long, a microwave the size of a shoebox, and a toilet with no door and nowhere to hide. You have already been awake for over a day. You have another day left to go, and the only other human being who can help you is close enough to touch and still, somehow, 1,000 miles from anyone else on Earth. This is what it actually looks like to fly the B-2 Spirit on a mission that can run 44 hours from takeoff to landing without a single stop. Not a layover, not a second crew waiting to swap in. 2 pilots, 1 aircraft, and a job that doesn't pause just because a human body needs it to. By the end of this, you'll understand why the hardest part of that flight was never the enemy on the ground. It was something almost nobody thinks to plan for.
And we'll get to the part of this mission that turned 2 combat pilots into men quietly doing math about their own bodily waste, because on a flight this long, that math actually matters more than you'd think. Getting to sit in that seat in the first place takes months before anyone even hands you a helmet. B-2 pilots go through a selection process that runs deeper than flight hours. Sleep studies, psychological screening, endurance testing designed to find out how a person actually behaves after 20, 30, 40 hours without real rest. Not how they perform on a good night's sleep in a simulator. The Air Force isn't just checking whether you can fly the jet. It's checking whether you'll still be making good decisions on hour 38, when your judgment is running on fumes and there's still a bomb run ahead of you. The whole aircraft is built around one brutal fact. It flies best with almost no crew at all. The B-2's fly-by-wire system can hold a cruise profile on its own well enough that, for long stretches, only 1 pilot needs to have hands on the controls. That's not a comfort feature. That's the only reason a 44-hour mission is even survivable with 2 people instead of 10. Everything else packed into the jet, the cot, the food, the toilet, exists to answer one question. How do you keep 2 human beings functional inside a space that was never designed to hold them for a day and a half? The livable part of that space is roughly 25 square feet. Picture a walk-in closet, and now put 2 ejection seats, a full control suite for a stealth bomber, and a place to sleep inside it. There's no walking around, there's no stretching your legs down an aisle, because there is no aisle. When Colonel Mel Deal and his co-pilot Brian Neal flew the longest B-2 sortie ever recorded, a 44.3-hour strike into Afghanistan on October 7, 2001, that 25 square feet was the entire world for both of them, for nearly 2 full days straight. No hallway to pace, no galley to walk to. Whatever you need, it's within arm's reach, or it simply doesn't exist for you right now. And here's the part that catches people off guard first. It isn't privacy you lose. Privacy was never really on the table. It's the illusion that you're ever alone with your own thoughts. Every sound the other guy makes, you hear it, whether you want to or not. Every shift in his seat, every breath. There's no door between the 2 of you for almost 2 days, and the air inside stays close and metallic and faintly electronic. The smell of recycled cabin air and warm avionics that never quite goes away. Food comes next, and food is where the mission stops being about the jet and starts being about the body underneath the flight suit. Weeks before a long sortie, crews retrain their own biology on purpose. Retired Lieutenant General Steve Basham, a former B-2 pilot, has described the prep work out loud. Nutrition education, sleep studies, learning exactly how food behaves inside a body sitting still at 40,000 feet. All of it mapped out before the wheels ever leave the ground. Before one 30-hour flight, Basham packed 8 sandwiches and a bag of trail mix. He barely touched any of it. Too many nerves, he said. You end up eating just to give your hands something to do, not because you're actually hungry. Inside the jet, there's a mini fridge and a microwave the size of something you'd find in a college dorm, both crammed into that same tight rest area behind the seats. Just enough to heat a self-heating meal pouch without ever leaving your seat. Noodles, mostly. Nothing that needs a fork and a plate and 2 free hands, because you don't have 2 free hands to spare. There's no flight attendant pushing a cart down an aisle. There's no galley crew prepping trays. Whatever's zipped inside that pouch is the entire menu for the next 40+ hours, and you eat it, strapped into a seat, a control stick an arm's length from your face, the smell of reheated broth mixing with jet fuel and recycled air until you stop noticing either one. There's no dining table, no sitting across from anyone while you eat, no small talk over a meal. Just 2 people chewing in parallel, both watching different instruments, both pretending the food is helping more than it is. Some crews swear the coffee is the only thing that gets them through the back half of the flight, bitter and lukewarm by the second cup, tasting faintly of the same recycled cabin air as everything else. It's not good coffee. It's just the only thing standing between a sleep-deprived pilot and a reaction time nobody wants tested at 40,000 feet. Then there's the sleep. And this is where rest stops meaning anything close to what you think it means. Behind the 2 ejection seats, mounted against the bulkhead, is a fold-down cot, roughly 6 feet of canvas that one pilot can lie flat on while the other flies. Crews rotate through it in 2 to 3 hour blocks, but lying down on that cot at cruising altitude is not the same as sleeping in your own bed. The engines never stop droning behind your skull. The airframe never stops its low, constant vibration, a hum you can feel in your teeth as much as hear. You're horizontal, eyes closed, fully aware that in 2 hours, maybe less, you're back in that seat and someone is depending on you to be sharp. Pilots call it managed fatigue, not rest, because rest implies you actually recover something. This barely stops you from falling apart. During the moments that matter most, taking off, hitting an aerial tanker for fuel, releasing a weapon, landing, both pilots have to be strapped in, fully alert, no exceptions, no half measures. Miss a scheduled air refueling and the entire mission can be over before the target's ever in range. The whole flight plan collapsing over an ocean with nothing to show for it. So sleep isn't scheduled around when your body wants it, it's scheduled around when the aircraft can spare you. Some crews are given prescribed sedatives beforehand, medications meant to force real unconsciousness into whatever short window the mission allows, because willing yourself to sleep on command in a vibrating metal shell with someone else's life resting on your alertness 2 hours from now turns out to be one of the harder things the human body is ever asked to do on purpose. There's a strange comfort in the routine of it too, and this is the part crews rarely talk about. The handoff itself becomes a small ritual. One pilot climbs into a cot still warm from wherever the last body was, the noise dulling slightly with your eyes shut. And for a moment, before the fatigue and the vibration take over again, it's almost peaceful. Almost. Then the aircraft dips through turbulence, or the radio crackles with a call sign, and you're wide awake again, heart going, remembering exactly where you are and how far you still have to go. You don't get a real night's sleep on this flight. You get pieces of one, borrowed 2 hours at a time, and you learn to take what you can get. Somewhere around hour 20, the line between the two starts to blur anyway. You stop being sure whether you actually slept or just closed your eyes for a while in a slightly quieter version of the same noise. Either way, the seat is waiting, and the other guy needs to close his eyes too. Now here's the part nobody thinks to ask about until they actually picture it.
44 hours.
2 humans.
1 aircraft sealed shut at altitude. What happens when you need the bathroom? The B-2 does have a toilet, technically, a small, sealed, chemical unit tucked into that same 25 square feet, with no door and barely any separation from the cockpit. Deal has talked about how thin that privacy really is. The other pilot can hear you. Turn his head and he can see you too. But here's the problem nobody designs around when they're drawing up a stealth bomber. That little chemical toilet was never built to hold 44 hours worth of anything. So the actual solution the Air Force settled on is something called a piddle pack. A sealed plastic pouch lined with a powder that turns liquid into a solid gel on contact. The same basic idea as what's inside a diaper, just repackaged for a cockpit at 40,000 feet. On Deal and Neil's record flight, the two of them were filling roughly 2 of these an hour, each. Do that math across 44 hours and you land somewhere around 100 pounds of solidified waste sitting inside the aircraft by the time they touch down. Weight they had to physically account for and offload once they were back on the ground. DL has said it plainly. That's just something you do to pass the time up there. Counting piddle packs, calculating weight. Because at some point on a flight this long, you genuinely run out of other things to occupy your brain. It sounds almost funny until you actually sit with what it means. This is a machine that can carry a 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb halfway around the planet and drop it within feet of a target nobody ever sees coming. And for a stretch of that same mission, 2 of the most highly trained pilots on Earth are doing arithmetic on their own bodily fluids because there was nowhere else for any of it to go. There's no janitorial crew waiting at cruising altitude. There's no relief attendant coming down the aisle with a fresh bag. Whatever the body produces over those 2 days, the 2 of you are carrying it home yourselves, sealed and counted, like cargo. And that, it turns out, is still not the hardest part. The hardest part is what happens to your mind. Not the food, not the cot, not the piddle pack stacking up behind the seats. The isolation. For 44 hours, you are one of exactly 2 human beings within 1,000 miles who know where you are and what you're carrying. No relief crew is coming to tap in. No one else on the planet is going to slide into that second seat so you can finally close your eyes for real, all the way, without one ear listening for the radio. Whatever fatigue you're fighting at hour 30, whatever fear or boredom or homesickness shows up uninvited somewhere over open ocean at 3 in the morning body clock time, you're carrying it alone, in a seat next to someone who is fighting the exact same thing and can't help you with it either, because he's buried in it too. Basham has described the weeks of prep before a mission like this, adjusting sleep cycles days in advance, rehearsing meals down to the pouch, running through sleep studies so the body already half knows what it's about to be asked to survive. None of that training touches the thing that actually wears people down on a flight like this, though, which is simply being that far from everyone you know for that long, sealed inside a space you are not allowed to leave. There's no phone call home at hour 20, no message from anyone who isn't already sitting 18 inches to your left. Whatever is happening back at Whiteman, whatever is happening in the rest of the world, you find out about it later, after you land, after the mission is already history. For 2 straight days, your entire universe is 1 seat, 1 cot, 1 other person, and the hum of engines that never once let you forget where you are. Because that's the detail people miss when they picture a stealth bomber. They picture the radar-evading skin, the $2 billion price tag, the bomb bay that can end a building in a single pass. They don't picture 2 men in a space smaller than most closets, eating noodles out of a foil pouch, timing their bathroom breaks by the hour, taking turns not quite sleeping on a canvas cot still warm from the last man. Because the machine only needed 2 of them to run it, and 2 of them was all there ever was. Deal and Neil landed back at Whiteman Air Force Base after that 44.3-hour mission, having flown one of the longest combat sorties in the history of aviation.
The strike itself, the part that actually made the news that week, took a fraction of that total time. Almost the entire mission was just 2 human beings keeping each other functional long enough to get there and get back. So the next time a B-2 shows up on a runway somewhere, all sharp angles and stealth and quiet menace, remember what's actually sitting inside it on a mission like that one. Not just a weapon. A closet-sized survival test for 2 people, running on managed fatigue, foil pouch noodles, and a piddle-pack math problem nobody signs up to solve out loud. And somewhere underneath all of it is the question worth actually sitting with. It's easy to ask whether the mission itself was worth flying. It's harder to ask what it costs 2 human beings to be the only ones who can fly it, alone together for 2 straight days, with absolutely nowhere else to go. If a story like this is the kind of thing you want more of, the next one's already waiting for you. Subscribe if you want to be there for it. You're looking at a cockpit the size of a bathtub. You've been sitting in it for 9 hours. Outside, it's 40,000 feet, minus 65 degrees, and the nearest friendly ground is somewhere over the horizon. Your mission isn't done. You can't land. You can't stretch. You can't even look away from your instruments for more than a few seconds. And you have to pee. This is the reality of long-range combat aviation, and it's something the military doesn't put in the recruitment brochures. Fighter pilots are some of the most physically and mentally elite people on Earth, but their cockpits are, by design, tiny, isolated, and deeply uncomfortable. So what actually happens inside one of those jets during a 10-hour mission? How do pilots eat, stay hydrated, manage their bodily functions, and remain sharp enough to make life or death decisions after nearly half a day in the air? The answers are stranger than you'd expect. To understand this, you have to start with the aircraft itself, because the cockpit determines almost everything else. A single-seat fighter, like the F-15 or F-16, gives you roughly 30 cubic feet of space. Compare that to your car, which gives you about 100. Now imagine sitting in that car seat, strapped in so tight you can barely move your hips, wearing a G-suit that squeezes your legs like a blood pressure cuff, a helmet that weighs close to 5 pounds, and an oxygen mask clamped to your face for the entire flight. That's the starting point, and the mission hasn't even begun yet. Long-range combat missions became a defining feature of modern air power during the Gulf War, and haven't gone away since. When the Air Force needs to strike a target thousands of miles away, or maintain air superiority over a theatre that requires continuous coverage, pilots can be airborne for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a stretch. B-2 stealth bomber crews have documented missions exceeding 30 hours with air refueling. Even standard fighter escort and strike missions routinely push past the 8-hour mark, when you factor in the transit to and from the combat zone. Which means everything about the pilot's body becomes a logistical problem that someone, somewhere, had to solve. Start with food. The military has developed what are called pilot meals, which sound like something off a business class menu, but are actually closer to a science experiment. The priority isn't taste, it's function.
Pilots need enough calories to maintain cognitive performance without the kind of digestive load that causes discomfort, gas, or the urgent need to use a bathroom. High-fibre foods are essentially off the table before a long mission. So are carbonated drinks, cruciferous vegetables, beans, anything that causes bloating. The reasoning is both practical and medical. At altitude, gas in your digestive system expands. The same physics that makes unopened chip bags puff up at 30,000 feet applies to what's inside your body. What pilots actually eat before a long sortie tends to be low-residue foods. Think white bread, rice, lean protein, bananas. Things that digest cleanly and don't create problems at altitude. Some squadrons have specific pre-mission meal protocols, almost like an athlete preparing for a race, down to what time you eat relative to takeoff. During the mission itself, if you're in a fighter cockpit, you're eating out of a bag with your hands while managing a 40,000-pound aircraft at 500 knots. There are in-flight meals for cockpit use, essentially specialised energy bars and high-calorie snacks designed to be opened and consumed with one hand, with gloves on, without crumbling into sensitive avionics. Tube foods, similar to what astronauts use, were tested and sometimes still appear in long-range operations. You bite the end off a tube and squeeze. Not glamorous, effective.
Hydration is actually a bigger concern than food. Pilots can go several hours without eating and maintain performance. But dehydration impairs judgment faster than almost any other factor short of G-force blackout or hypoxia. The cockpit environment makes this worse because the pressurized, climate-controlled air inside the jet is extremely dry. Pilots lose moisture through every breath. A mission that feels like it's going fine can quietly be degrading your cognitive performance through dehydration before you even feel thirsty. Modern flight suits include a hydration system for longer missions. Essentially, a bladder of water with a hose routed into the cockpit that pilots can sip from through a valve in their oxygen mask. But drinking water means eventually needing to get rid of water. And in a fighter cockpit, there is no bathroom. This is the part nobody glamorizes in the Top Gun sequel. Military aviation has grappled with the urination problem for decades, and the solutions have evolved in ways that range from engineering marvel to genuinely uncomfortable improvisation. The earliest approach was simply to not drink water. Pilots went into long missions dehydrated on purpose to avoid the problem. Unsurprisingly, this caused a different set of performance issues, and the military eventually figured out that pilots making critical navigation and weapons decisions were doing so with impaired cognition because they'd stopped drinking fluids 6 hours earlier. The next solution was the piddle pack, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's an absorbent bag with a tube and a one-way valve, similar in concept to what astronauts use. The pilot uses it in the cockpit, the bag seals, and the contents are disposed of after landing. Using one while strapped into a 5-point harness in a G-suit at altitude while flying a combat aircraft is not a simple task. Pilots describe it as one of those skills that takes practice and isn't covered in ground school. There is an entire body of institutional knowledge passed down informally in squadrons about how to manage this without making a significant mess in a very small space. Female pilots faced an even larger problem, since the design of piddle packs was created almost exclusively with male anatomy in mind. which wasn't much of a consideration for most of aviation's history. It's been an ongoing issue the military has slowly moved to address with modified designs. For longer-range bomber missions, some aircraft have what amounts to a very basic onboard toilet, a tube system that routes waste to a containment tank. In the B-52 and similar large aircraft, there's slightly more physical space to work with, though privacy is not a concept that exists. For crews of 2 or more, you work out an unspoken understanding with your crewmate. You look at your instruments.
Everyone pretends they can't hear anything. Moving on. If the challenge of eating and urination sounds like something that would break a person's focus, that's because it can. But the bigger threat to mission performance isn't the logistics of bodily functions, it's sleep deprivation. Long missions don't just tire the body, they degrade the specific cognitive functions that pilots need most. Situation awareness, decision speed, threat assessment, the ability to rapidly interpret conflicting information and act on it. These are the skills that take the hardest hit after 6 or more hours in the air. Fatigue doesn't feel the way people expect. It doesn't hit like exhaustion after a sprint, it creeps in. You start making small errors, you miss a radio call, you misread a coordinate. In a non-combat environment, that's a training note. In combat, it's a different conversation. The military's approach to managing this is layered. The first layer is selection. The pilots who fly the longest, most demanding missions are chosen in part because of documented ability to perform under sustained physical and cognitive stress. The training pipeline filters for this. But selection only goes so far. The second layer is pharmaceuticals, and this is one of the less discussed aspects of long-range aviation. Go pills and no-go pills are real, and they have official names. Dextroamphetamine, known in aviation circles as go pills, have been used by military aviators for decades to sustain alertness on long missions. The Air Force has formal protocols around their use, dosing, timing, and mandatory rest periods after. They're not handed out casually. A flight surgeon has to approve their use, and there are documented cases where stimulant use during missions has been scrutinized, including a high-profile friendly fire incident in Afghanistan in 2002, where go pill use was raised as a contributing factor. The military's position has evolved since then, with more stringent controls, but the pills haven't gone away. The operational reality is that there are missions where you simply cannot have a pilot falling asleep at the stick, and ground coffee isn't rated for a combat aircraft. No-go pills are the counterpart. Typically a short-acting sedative, they're used post-mission to help pilots sleep during the narrow rest window before they're expected to fly again. The concern is always the same. You need the pilot sharp for the next mission, not still buzzing from stimulants at 3 a.m. in a forward operating base. We cover this kind of deep operational content every week. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. Beyond pharmaceuticals, there are behavioral techniques. Cockpit discipline on long missions includes deliberate scan patterns designed to keep the brain actively engaged, rather than slipping into autopilot complacency. Crew coordination on multi-crew aircraft means distributing cognitive load so no single person is carrying full responsibility for awareness at all times. Periodic radio check-ins with AWACS or ground control serve a dual function, communicating mission status and, less formally, keeping the crew engaged with the outside world.
There's also something pilots describe as the wall, which hits differently than normal tiredness. It typically arrives somewhere between hours 5 and 7 of a long mission, depending on pre-mission rest, how intense the early phases were, and individual variation. It's a period where fatigue sharpens into something more acute. Experienced pilots know it's coming and have developed personal routines for pushing through it. Eating, moving what little can be moved in a flight suit, going through checklists verbally, even when they've long since been memorized. The goal is to keep the brain from entering a maintenance mode it was never designed to resist. The physical toll adds another dimension. Sustained G-forces during maneuvering portions of a mission cause real strain, even with anti-G suits. The suit inflates around your legs and abdomen to keep blood from pooling away from your brain during high G turns. But it does nothing for the cumulative physical fatigue of hours of micromuscular tension as your body fights against forces it was never designed for. After a 2-hour training exercise with heavy maneuvering, pilots walk away with the muscle soreness of a hard gym session. After 10 hours of a combat sortie with intermittent high-G work, the physical depletion is real. What ties all of this together is preparation. The pilots who make it through the longest, hardest missions aren't doing so through willpower alone. They're doing it through weeks and months of specific training for exactly this scenario. They know what they'll eat and when. They've practiced managing hydration. They've used the piddle pack enough times in a ground simulator that it's not an emergency when it happens at 40,000 feet. They've been through enough go pill protocols to know precisely how stimulants interact with their personal physiology. They've flown enough long-range training sorties to recognize what hour 6 feels like and know they can get to hour 10. The cockpit is the smallest, least forgiving office in the world, but the people sitting in it have been engineered, selected and trained to function in it anyway. It just requires solving a lot of problems that never make it into the highlight reel. Fighter pilots started as ordinary people who went through extraordinary preparation. The 10-hour mission isn't just a flight, it's the end product of everything that came before it. There's another one on screen if you're not done yet. 14 people climb into a 40-year-old cargo plane with a 105mm howitzer bolted to the side of it. And for the next 8 hours, nobody on board will see the sun. They take off after dark. They land after dark. In between, they fly slow circles over enemy territory at 3,000 feet, close enough that a man on the ground with a rifle could end the whole mission with a lucky shot. And they do it on purpose. Because somewhere underneath them, American or Allied troops are pinned down, and the only thing standing between them and being overrun is whatever's hanging out of the side of this aircraft. This is the AC-130 gunship, and the 8-hour mission is the easy part of the job description. The hard part is everything else: the eating, the sleeping, the bathroom breaks, the boredom, the 11 seconds of pure terror, repeated as many times as the mission demands. Here's what almost nobody outside the gunship community actually understands. This isn't a fighter jet making one fast pass and going home. A fighter can loiter over a target for maybe 30 minutes before it needs to refuel. The AC-130 can refuel in the air, mid-flight, in the dark, and keep going. Missions have stretched past 24 hours. One of the longest on record ran for 36 hours straight, non-stop, crew swapping who was awake and who was resting,
the plane never landing once. 8 hours isn't even the long version. 8 hours is a normal Tuesday. So the question becomes obvious. How do you keep 5, 10, 14 human beings alert, fed, calm, and ready to make split-second life or death decisions for that long? In a plane with no windows to speak of, no bathroom worth the name, and a war happening underneath the floor. Start with who's actually on board, because the crew is bigger than people assume. Up front, you've got 2 pilots flying what is essentially a slow, deliberate circle around the target, a maneuver crews call the pylon turn, banking the aircraft so the guns on one side stay locked onto a fixed point on the ground for as long as it takes. Behind them, a flight engineer is watching the 4 engines like a hawk, because losing one this far from home with this much weight on board is not a small problem. Then there's the fire control officer, the navigator, the electronic warfare officer, and on the newer models, sensor operators running infrared cameras precise enough to tell the difference between a rifle and a shovel from over a mile up. In the back, gunners and loadmasters are physically loading rounds, heavy ones, by hand, over and over for hours. Every one of those jobs requires total focus. And every one of those people still has to eat. Crews will tell you the food on a gunship is not glamorous. It's whatever can survive a flight without spoiling, doesn't need to be cooked, and can be eaten one-handed without taking your eyes off a screen. Protein bars, sandwiches packed before takeoff, and, almost universally, mentioned by crew after crew across different squadrons and different decades, there's one item that comes up over and over: muffins. Cheap, mass-produced, ridiculously calorie-dense muffins, eaten by the dozen over the course of a single flight. Because on an 8-hour mission, your body is burning through fuel just from the adrenaline and the cold and the constant low-grade tension, and there's no time for a real meal. One former loadmaster estimated his crew was putting away well over 4,000 calories of muffins alone on a single sortie. Not because anyone wanted to, because the body demanded it, and a muffin was the fastest thing to get into your hand. There's no real kitchen up here, there's barely a bathroom. What there is a job, and the job doesn't pause for hunger. Therefore, the crew builds a rhythm around the mission instead of around meals, eating when there's a lull, eating between target runs, eating with one eye still on the radio. But that rhythm only works if everyone trusts everyone else to do their job perfectly every single time. And that trust gets built somewhere most people never see: the hours of nothing, before the moment that matters. Most of an 8-hour mission is not combat, it's transit. It's holding a pattern over a quiet stretch of desert or mountain, watching, waiting, listening to radio chatter from troops who may or may not need help tonight. It is, by every account from people who've actually done it, mind-numbingly boring for stretches of time anyway. And that boredom is dangerous in its own way, because the moment everyone relaxes is exactly the moment something can go wrong on the ground, fast, and the gunship needs to be ready in seconds, not minutes. So crews develop their own ways of staying sharp without losing the edge. Dark humour, inside jokes that would mean nothing to an outsider and everything to the people in that fuselage. Pranks that, by more than one account, have sent flight surgeons and psychologists running for the door, trying to figure out if everyone on board is actually okay. It sounds strange from the outside. From the inside, it's survival. You cannot keep 14 people at maximum readiness for 8 straight hours through fear alone. You keep them sharp by keeping them human, by letting off pressure in small doses so it doesn't build up and break something when it matters most. But then the radio call comes in. Troops in contact. And everything changes in the space of a breath. The boredom is gone instantly. Every position on the aircraft snaps into a role they've rehearsed hundreds of times. The pilots bank into the pylon turn. The sensor operators lock onto the coordinates. The fire control officer is talking to a joint terminal attack controller on the ground, a soldier in the dirt, under fire, calling out exactly where the enemy is relative to his own position, in real time, while bullets are flying near him. One mistake in that conversation, one number transposed, 1 second of hesitation, and the difference is between saving the people on the ground and becoming the reason they don't go home. This is the part of the job that crews describe almost reverently, and almost nobody talks about casually. There's a standard on board these aircraft that doesn't bend. Crews call it the perfection standard, and it isn't a slogan. It's the literal operating reality of the job. A single error doesn't just risk the 14 people on the plane, it can mean good people on the ground, people who are trusting a voice on the radio they will never meet, die because of it. So nothing is improvised, nothing is guessed. The targeting process is slow, deliberate, and checked, even when the situation on the ground is anything but slow. And then the guns fire. Depending on the version of the aircraft and the threat, that might be a 105mm howitzer, a 40mm autocannon, or rapid-fire 25mm cannons. Each one suited to a different kind of target. Each one loaded by hand in the back of the plane by a crew member working in a cramped, freezing, deafening space, while the aircraft is banking in a tight circle 3,000 feet above a firefight. Loadmasters have described physically muscling rounds into position during the heaviest nights of fighting, over and over, until their arms gave out and somebody else took over. From the ground, the effect is almost mythical. Troops who've called in an AC-130 during a firefight describe it as the single most reassuring sound in the world. The deep, steady growl of that aircraft circling overhead in the dark. Because it means the math of the fight just changed in their favour. The gunship doesn't need daylight. It doesn't need clear skies. Its entire reason for existing is to own the night, to see what the enemy can't see it seeing, and to end a threat before the enemy even understands where the shot came from. But the crew doesn't get to celebrate that moment. Therefore, almost as soon as the target is neutralised and the ground unit confirms they're clear, the aircraft has to reset. Because there might be another call 10 minutes later, or an hour later, or nothing at all for the rest of the flight. The same 5 people who were locked in a life or death targeting sequence 90 seconds ago are back to scanning empty terrain, eating a muffin, checking fuel, waiting. This back and forth, long stretches of nothing, sudden bursts of the highest stakes work imaginable, then back to nothing, happens again and again across an 8-hour mission. It is, by the description of people who've lived it, one of the strangest psychological experiences a human being can have. Your body and mind have to be capable of going from half-asleep boredom to surgical precision in the time it takes a radio call to finish, and then come back down again, over and over, for the length of an entire workday compressed into darkness. It takes a toll.
crew members who've flown hundreds of these missions talk openly now about what that switch does to a person over years of repetition. A brain that gets rewired to treat split-second, life-or-death decision-making as normal, and then struggles to turn that wiring off once the deployment ends and life goes back to something ordinary. The intensity that keeps a 14-person crew alive at 3,000 feet over hostile ground doesn't just disappear when the wheels touch down back home. For some, it follows them for years. And still, when the sun comes up and the aircraft finally turns for home after 8 hours circling in the dark, the job isn't really finished. There's a debrief. There's the next mission already on the schedule, sometimes the same night, sometimes the next. There's another set of muffins to pack, another full tank of fuel, another 14 people who will climb back into that same airframe and do it all over again. Because somewhere out there, another unit on the ground is going to need that sound overhead. That low, steady growl in the dark that means somebody is watching and somebody is ready. That's the job, not one moment of glory. Hundreds of hours of waiting, broken by seconds that decide who goes home and who doesn't. Carried by a crew running on muffins, training, and the kind of trust in each other that most people never have to test in their entire lives.
In 1960, the Air Force figured out how to keep nuclear-armed bombers in the sky every single hour of every single day. 12 B-52s, always airborne, always loaded, always within striking distance of a Soviet target. The crews flew 24-hour patrols over the Arctic and the Mediterranean, carrying thermonuclear weapons. And somehow, in between watching fuel gauges and waiting for a launch order everyone hoped would never come, they had to figure out how to eat, sleep, and not lose their minds. That program ran for 8 years. It ended in 1968. But the B-52 never stopped flying missions long enough to break a normal person. Today's crews still pull 20-hour sorties, sealed inside a 60-year-old airframe with no bed, barely a toilet, and almost no privacy. So how do 5 people survive most of a full day locked inside a flying tube without going insane? Or worse, falling asleep at the controls of a nuclear-capable bomber? Let's get into it. Here's what almost nobody outside the squadron understands about this job. People picture a fighter pilot, alone in a cockpit, screaming through the sky for an hour or two. That's not this. The B-52 is enormous, longer than a basketball court is wide, and it carries 5 people scattered across 2 separate levels that barely connect. Upstairs, the pilot and co-pilot sit side by side at the controls, with the electronic warfare officer behind them watching for threats. Downstairs, in a windowless compartment with no outside view at all, the navigator and radar navigator work the radar and the bomb run calculations, staring at screens in a room some crews have called the black hole, because that's exactly what it feels like after 12 hours. They take off as a team, but the moment the wheels leave the ground, that team effectively splits into 2 separate worlds that talk to each other over an intercom and almost never see daylight at the same time. The pilots watch the sun move across the sky for 20 hours straight. The navigators downstairs can't see outside at all. They know what time it is by their watch and by what the pilots tell them, not by anything their own eyes can confirm. That isolation sounds small until you remember these are the people calculating bomb runs and reading enemy radar. So the intercom discipline on this aircraft is almost obsessive. Every position calls out what they're doing before they do it, because the alternative is 2 crew members working off 2 different pictures of reality without realizing it. 12 hours into a mission, exhausted, with no easy way to double check. The mission usually starts hours before the jet ever moves.
Crews show up for a brief that can run 2 or 3 hours on its own, going over the route, the refueling points, the weather, the threat picture. By the time they actually strap in, they've already been awake and working for half a day. Then they climb to altitude and the real test begins. 20 hours is longer than most people's entire waking day. It's long enough to take off in daylight, fly through an entire night, and land the next afternoon having never really slept. Somewhere in the middle of all this, the jet has to refuel mid-air, sometimes more than once on a 20-hour sortie. And that single maneuver resets the entire crew's adrenaline for about 15 minutes. A tanker pulls in close overhead. A boom operator threads a fuel line into a receptacle on the B-52, while both aircraft hold formation at the same speed, and one wrong move from either pilot can end the flight in a way nobody wants to think about. It's the kind of moment that snaps a half-asleep crew wide awake faster than any amount of coffee could. So what do you do with the other 19 hours and 45 minutes? You eat when you can, not when you want to. The in-flight kitchen back at base packs a box lunch, sandwiches, some fruit, maybe a sleeve of crackers, and crews have learned the hard way that it's smart to bring your own food too. Because a box lunch made 12 hours before a 20-hour flight is not exactly fine dining by the time you get to it. There's a tiny electric oven on board for frozen meals, and generations of crew members will tell you the same joke. It either burns the edges or leaves the middle ice cold, and there's no real way to fix that mid-flight except opening it every few minutes and poking at it like you're defusing something. Coffee matters more than food. Crews bring thermoses, request extra jugs from the flight kitchen, and ration caffeine across the mission the way you'd ration fuel. Because here's the thing nobody tells you going in. Your body doesn't know it's supposed to stay awake for 20 straight hours. It just knows it's 3 in the morning and wants to shut down, whether there's a war going on underneath you or not. That's where fatigue management stops being a suggestion and becomes a real medical program. Flight surgeons can prescribe what crews call go pills, low-dose stimulants used specifically for missions over 12 hours, and they're handed out and counted with the same precision as the weapon's load. Pilots take them at planned moments, usually timed right before something demanding like a mid-air refueling, not just whenever someone starts yawning. And there's a flip side to it too. After landing, crews are given what they call no-go pills, sedatives meant to force the body back onto a normal sleep schedule, because you can't just land after a day awake and expect to fall asleep on command. The whole system exists because the Air Force learned through actual crashes that exhausted aircrew make the same mistakes drunk drivers do. They just make them at 30,000 feet. Sleep itself is almost a myth on this jet. There's a small foam pad on the upper deck, barely big enough to lie on, and most crew members will tell you they use it rarely, if ever, because someone always has to be alert. And on a 5-person crew, there's rarely a moment where enough people can stand down at once to make it worth the trouble. Compare that to the B-2, which actually has a fold-out cot for its 2-person crew. The B-52 was built in the 1950s. Comfort was never part of the design brief. And then there's the bathroom situation, which is somehow both the funniest and most miserable part of this entire job. The B-52 has no real toilet. What it has is a bucket with a seat on it, tucked behind the electronic warfare officer's station, known across generations of crews as the honey bucket. There's also a basic urinal funnel built into the side of the fuselage, and old crew chiefs will tell you that men who could put a bomb on a target from 6 miles up somehow could not hit that funnel to save their lives, to the point where the skin of the aircraft used to corrode underneath it. A lot of crews quietly take something like Imodium before a long sortie, on the simple logic that the fewer trips to that bucket, the better the next 20 hours are going to go. As more women have moved into bomber crews in recent years, the Air Force has actually started adding privacy curtains around that station, which tells you something about just how little thought went into crew dignity when this airplane was designed back in the 1950s. Now here's the part that should genuinely worry you a little. If something goes wrong on this airplane, getting out isn't simple either. The pilots eject upward the way you'd expect. But the navigator and radar navigator, sitting downstairs in that windowless lower deck, eject straight down through hatches in the floor of the aircraft. That seat needs a minimum altitude and enough forward speed to even work. Eject too low and the parachute simply doesn't have time to open before you hit the ground. And if there's a sixth person on board, an instructor or an extra crew member, they don't get an ejection seat at all. Their plan is to manually bail out through the same hole the navigators leave behind after the navigators have already gone. So for 20 hours straight, 2 members of every crew are sitting on top of a piece of engineering that only works under very specific conditions, doing math problems and watching radar screens like it's just another Tuesday. You'd think knowing that would wreck a person's nerves. Mostly it doesn't. Crews train on it, brief it before every flight, and then mentally file it away the same way airline passengers ignore the safety card. It's just part of the job. If stories like this are the kind of thing that pulls you in, this channel digs into military life beyond the headlines pretty regularly, so subscribing means you won't miss the next one. So why do people actually want this job? Ask any long-time bomber crew member and you'll hear some version of the same answer. It's not really about the food or the sleep or the bucket behind the EWO seat. It's the crew itself. 5 people who've spent 20 hours together in a windowless tube develop a kind of trust. That's hard to find anywhere else because they've watched each other handle exhaustion, boredom, and the genuine weight of carrying a nuclear-capable aircraft across an ocean and back. There's also the simple fact that very few people on Earth will ever do what they do. Flying a 60-plus-year-old strategic bomber on a mission that can stretch across multiple time zones and multiple sunrises is not a normal job by any measure, and the people who stay in it tend to take real pride in being able to say they did it, and it connects to something bigger than any one mission. Those Cold War crews flying Chrome Dome in the 1960s weren't just testing endurance for fun. They were part of a deterrence strategy built on a simple, brutal idea. If enough nuclear-armed bombers are already in the air at all times, an enemy can't wipe out the entire force in a surprise strike, which means retaliation is always possible, which means, in theory, nobody pulls the trigger in the first place. That program eventually ended after a string of accidents made continuous airborne nuclear alert too risky to keep running. But the underlying logic never really went away. Decades later, during operations overseas in the early 2000s, B-52 crews were flying combat sorties, stretching past 20 hours from bases, thousands of miles from the target, refueling mid-air from tankers, crossing entire oceans on a single sortie, because the aircraft and the mission demand it just as much today as it did when this program started. The B-52 itself is expected to keep flying into the 2050s, which means crews who haven't even joined the Air Force yet will eventually sit in that same windowless lower deck, eat from the same kind of box lunch, and learn to live with the same honey bucket that crews were complaining about back in Vietnam. The airplane changes engines and avionics over the decades. The human part of the job barely changes at all. That's the real story behind this aircraft. It was never really about the bombs. It was about how long the human body and mind can be pushed before something breaks, and how the Air Force spent 70 years quietly building an entire system, pills, schedules, food, bathroom buckets, and all just to keep that line from ever being crossed. There's another one on screen if you're not done yet.
In 1966, a test pilot named Bill Weaver watched his own aeroplane come apart around him at 3 times the speed of sound, and he lived to describe it in detail. Not because he ejected. The plane disintegrated so violently that the ejection seat never got the chance to fire. He was thrown clear, still strapped into his chair, at over Mach 3 at the edge of space in a suit that could barely bend at the elbow. And the only reason he's not a footnote in an accident report is the thing this video is actually about.
Not the aeroplane, the suit. Everyone knows the SR-71 Blackbird as the fastest jet ever built, the plane that could outrun a missile by simply flying away from it. What almost nobody talks about is what it took to survive being inside one. Because at 85,000 feet, in an aircraft that ran hotter than a kitchen oven on the outside and colder than a freezer on the inside, the plane wasn't the hard part. Staying alive long enough to fly it was. Here's the question worth asking.
If the jet was the easy part of the SR-71 program, and the pilot's own equipment was the thing constantly working against him, how did anyone survive a full mission? To answer that, you have to start hours before the plane ever left the ground. Before any of that, the Air Force had to find men who could physically tolerate the program in the first place. The SR-71's pilots and their backseat reconnaissance systems officers were pulled from an already small pool of experienced fighter pilots, and then narrowed further through altitude chamber runs, centrifuge testing, and psychological screening designed to weed out anyone who couldn't stay calm while their own body was being pushed toward its structural limits. Being a great pilot got you considered. It didn't get you selected. What actually mattered was whether a man could sit inside a suit that was actively working against him for hours at a time and keep flying the airplane anyway. A Blackbird pilot's day started with a steak and eggs breakfast, which sounds almost quaint until you learn why. High protein, low residue food, because there would be no bathroom breaks for the next 4 to 6 hours. And because the last thing a flight surgeon wanted in a pilot's gut at 85,000 feet was gas expanding in a nearly airless cabin. Then came the part nobody puts in the recruiting poster. An hour, sometimes longer, of breathing pure oxygen through a mask before the suit even went on. This wasn't optional, and it wasn't precautionary theatre. Nitrogen dissolved in the bloodstream expands into bubbles at altitude, the same mechanism that gives deep-sea divers the bends. And at 85,000 feet, with a suit that could fail, a pilot with unpurged nitrogen in his blood could develop those bubbles in his joints and his brain in minutes. So they sat and they breathed and they waited for their own blood to be safe to fly. And that hour alone was its own kind of ordeal. No talking, no reading, just a mask, a chair, and the low hiss of oxygen, while a man who was about to fly the fastest aircraft on Earth had nothing to do but sit with his own thoughts. Pilots have described it less like preparation and more like waiting outside an operating room, except the patient and the surgeon were the same person. Then 2 technicians dressed him, not helped him get dressed, dressed him, piece by piece, like a knight going into a suit of armour nobody expected him to walk away from. The full pressure suit, later versions called the S-1030, was built on the same lineage as the suits that would go to the moon. It had to be, because above roughly 63,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure drops so low that the water in human blood and saliva starts to boil at body temperature. Pilots and flight surgeons call it Armstrong's line. Cross it unprotected, and you don't slowly lose consciousness. Your body starts to boil from the inside, and you have seconds, not minutes, before it's unrecoverable. So the suit's entire job was to manufacture a survivable slice of sea level around one human being 10 miles above the Earth. And it did that job by inflating. Hard. A full pressure suit at altitude doesn't feel like clothing.
It feels like being sealed inside a firm balloon shaped vaguely like a man. Pilots described trying to bend an arm against a suit at full pressure as fighting the suit itself. Every single motion, every reach for a switch, a small negotiation with several pounds of internal air pressure that did not want to move. Grabbing a control stick wasn't instinct anymore. It was labor. The gloves made it worse. Each finger joint had to be custom fitted months in advance, because a glove that was even slightly loose would balloon under pressure and make it impossible to feel a switch, let alone flip one.
The helmet locked onto a neck ring that left almost no give for turning the head. So pilots learned to swivel their whole upper body just to check a mirror or glance at the RSO seated a few feet behind them. And the RSO had it no easier. Buried in the back seat, with no forward view at all, he ran the cameras, the sensors, the navigation, and the electronic countermeasures that were the entire reason the mission existed. All while wearing the same suit, fighting him for every motion. If the pilot's job was flying a machine that wanted to kill him, the RSO's job was running that machine's brain from inside a straitjacket. Now stack the next problem on top of that one. The cockpit the pilot sat in was not comfortable either. On the ground, fueled and ready, the SR-71 leaked. Visibly. Fuel dripped from the wings and pooled under the aircraft before takeoff. And ground crews simply expected it, because the airframe's panels were built with intentional gaps to allow for something almost nobody outside the program understood at the time. At cruise speed, Mach 3.2, friction with the air heated the aircraft's skin to somewhere between 300 and 600 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the panel. And the titanium structure expanded so much in flight that those gaps closed and the leaking stopped entirely once the jet was moving. The plane, in other words, was built to leak on the ground and seal itself shut through heat alone once airborne. Meanwhile, the crew, sealed inside their suits, sat in a cockpit where the canopy glass could reach temperatures that would blister skin on contact, while the air conditioning system fought to keep the men themselves from cooking. Pilots talked about the noise almost as much as the heat.
At cruise, the engines and the rush of air across an airframe, travelling faster than a rifle bullet, produced a constant physical vibration through the seat and the floor, felt more than heard through a suit that muffled almost everything else. Sweat pooled inside the suit with nowhere to go, and a 4-hour sortie could leave a pilot several pounds lighter by the time he climbed out. Most of it water weight wrung out of him by a cockpit that ran hot on one side of the glass and murderous on the other. So far, that's already a lot to survive before anyone's even fired an engine. But the mission hadn't started. Even the fuel fought them. The SR-71 ran on a special blend called JP7, chosen specifically because it was so hard to ignite that a lit match dropped into a bucket of it would simply go out. Ground crews needed it that way, because a fuel that could vaporize and combust easily around an airframe running hundreds of degrees hot would have turned every takeoff into a gamble.
So the same heat that sealed the fuselage shut in flight was also carefully managed so it wouldn't ignite the fuel sitting inches away. Nothing about this aircraft got to be simple. Every solution came bolted to a new problem. and the men flying it absorbed whatever problem was left over once the engineers had solved the ones that would have destroyed the plane outright. Climb to altitude and the suit's job changes again. Above 85,000 feet, the curvature of the Earth becomes visible. The sky overhead goes from blue to a deep starless black, even in daylight. And a pilot is higher than 99% of the atmosphere below him. It is, by every account from the men who flew it, beautiful. It is also the point where a single seal failure, a single cracked visor, becomes a countdown measured in seconds rather than minutes. Pilots trained obsessively for explosive decompression because there was no slow version of that failure to prepare for. There is only the version where the suit either saves you immediately or it doesn't. By the time a Blackbird leveled off at cruise, it was moving faster than a rifle bullet, covering roughly a mile every 2 seconds and outrunning most surface-to-air missiles simply by being somewhere else before the missile's guidance system finished catching up. Over hostile territory, evasive action wasn't a hard bank or a dive, it was acceleration. Push the throttles forward and the missile problem often solved itself. But that same speed meant a mission over denied territory left almost no room for a mistake. A wrong setting, a stuck valve, a suit seal that hadn't been checked twice, and the machine built to outrun the world's best air defences could kill its own crew faster than any enemy ever managed to. And that brings us back to Bill Weaver on January 25th, 1966, somewhere over New Mexico, testing the outer edges of what the airframe could survive. The SR-71 he was flying entered an unrecoverable violent instability at more than 3 times the speed of sound, and it broke apart around him with a force that investigators later compared to an explosion. He never touched the ejection handle. He didn't need to. The disintegration of the aircraft ripped his seat free of the wreckage entirely, and Weaver, still strapped into that seat, tumbled through the thin, brutally cold, nearly airless air at the edge of space. Protected by nothing but the suit 2 technicians had zipped him into hours earlier. His pressure suit held. It kept him from Armstrong's line, doing to his body what it's designed to do to unprotected tissue. His parachute deployed automatically as he fell into thicker air, and he came down alive, disoriented, badly shaken, but alive. His backseater, Jim Zweyer, did not survive the breakup. The suit is why one man walked away from an accident that by every reasonable measure should have killed them both. That's the part of the SR-71 story that rarely makes the highlight reel. Not the top speed record, not the spy plane missions, not the fact that no Blackbird was ever shot down in its operational life. The suit. The unglamorous, restrictive, exhausting piece of equipment that a pilot could barely raise his own arm inside of. And that same piece of equipment is the only reason a man could fall out of a disintegrating aircraft at Mach 3 and land in the desert to tell people about it. Every account from pilots who flew the program describes the same trade. Hours of preparation for a few hours of flight. A suit that made the simplest cockpit task feel like manual labor. A body that came home dehydrated, sore, sometimes bruised from the suit's own joints digging into the skin during a long mission. Because the price of surviving 85,000 feet was never comfort. It was constraint. Every ounce of freedom of movement they gave up on the ground was freedom of movement the atmosphere would have taken from them anyway, permanently, the moment something failed. So maybe that's the real question this story leaves behind. Not whether the SR-71 was the greatest aircraft ever built. Plenty of people have already answered that one. It's whether the men willing to sit inside a suit that fought them for every inch of movement, breathe pure oxygen for an hour before they even reached the runway, and trust their lives to a pressurized shell 2 technicians sealed shut by hand, actually got the harder job in the entire program. Because here's the trade nobody signed up for out loud. Kelly Johnson and the engineers at Skunk Works got to solve their problem once, on paper, in a wind tunnel, with time to get it right. The pilots had to solve theirs live, at 3 times the speed of sound, wearing the answer on their own bodies. Every single flight. If the suit held, nobody ever heard about it. If it didn't, there usually wasn't much left to investigate. Bill Weaver got the version of that story where the suit held anyway, even after the plane around him didn't. Most of the men who flew the Blackbird never had to find out. But every one of them dressed for that possibility before every single sortie, and then climbed into the cockpit anyway. The jet just had to survive the sky. The pilots had to survive the jet.